He took them and everything that belonged to him, and he helped them cross the river. But Jacob stayed apart by himself, and a stranger wrestled with him until dawn broke. When the stranger saw that Jacob couldn't be defeated, the stranger grabbed Jacob's thigh and tore a muscle in his thigh as the stranger wrestled with him. The stranger said, "Let me go, because the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I won't let you go until you bless me." The stranger said to Jacob, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And then the stranger said, "Your name won't be Jacob any longer, but Israel, because you struggled with God and with men and won." Jacob also asked and said, "Tell me your name." But the stranger said, "Why do you ask for my name?" And it was there that the stranger blessed Jacob. Jacob named the place Peniel, because I've seen God face to face, and my life has been saved. The sun rose as Jacob passed Peniel, limping because he was gone. Friends, this is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
For this Sunday. I find the book itself fascinating and troubling and challenging and expansive. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of a good telenovela. It has everything. It has drama, death, life, deception, twists and turns. And it just so happens that this is also the book that begins everything for us as God's beloved people. And there is much scholarship on it, as you might guess, a great deal of debate about its contents. But I love the whole Genesis for all of its ridiculous messiness, because regardless of how much people in these stories mess up, and they mess up a lot, it is also the beginning of God's promise, the beginning of hope for all humanity, the first glances at how God offers us chance after chance to get it right. It is the book that first lets us know that God will never leave us, no matter what we do. Genesis is the beginning of God's unending grace. It's where it all starts. And in this short story of Jacob the deceiver, the twin brother to Esau, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, the grandson of Abraham and Sarah, we have a moment to see God's continuous commitment to humanity among broken people. Now, you're probably wondering how a wrestling match can offer us an example of God's commitment to us, and that's a fair question. Historically, this story has been treated as a straightforward one, where Jacob is the triumphant yet wounded victor. But like the rest of Genesis, it is a complicated story within this larger telenovela. It is essentially about someone sneaking up on Jacob while he is in a vulnerable place. And for survivors of abuse and assault, this can actually be a really difficult story. And so if this is such a story for you today, know that even in the midst of this story and all of our stories, that God is present and has not and will not ever desert you. Now, this story is nestled within Jacob's larger narrative at a time when he is seeking reconciliation with his brother Esau. Jacob was in the middle of preparing to face his brother, whom he had swindled out of his inheritance and his father's blessing as the head of the family a few chapters back in Genesis. Jacob was about to go and resettle back in his homeland after spending 20 years away. But before he could do that, he needed to make peace with Esau. It had been 20 years since his brother had threatened to kill him because of his theft. And so Jacob had no idea what Esau's state of mind might be after all those years. And so in preparation for his arrival, he sent word ahead to let Esau know he was coming. When Jacob's men returned from meeting with Esau, they informed him Esau had set off with 400 men upon hearing of his brother's impending arrival, giving Jacob no clear indication what his intentions were. So Jacob was left in the dark about his brother's motives. Was he planning to get the jump on Jacob and finally kill him for his theft? Was he planning on welcoming him with open arms? Jacob had no idea. And so here he is in our story this morning, waiting, having prepared for various scenarios that might unfold once Esau found him. He sent his family and all of his household ahead of him. He even prepared gifts to meet Esau along the way, going in multiple routes to ensure that at least one of them might reach Esau before Esau got to him. Or that if Esau was angry, that he wouldn't destroy all that Jacob had, and some of his household would get to their destination safely. And so he sees his family off through the river, but he does not go with them. Maybe he wasn't ready to go. Maybe he was scared to go on with them, and fear paralyzed him. We don't know that part. But there he remained at some point. And at some point, a stranger, we don't actually know who yet in the story, begins to wrestle with him. And they wrestled for quite some time. It says, until the breaking of the morning sunlight. Now, upon reading this, most people imagine that Jacob was wrestling from evening until the next morning. But that's not likely to be the case, actually. It was pretty common to travel with one's household during the night because you wanted to avoid traveling in the heat of the day. So this stranger most likely came upon Jacob when it was already dark. We don't know exactly how long they wrestled for, but the writer lets us know that it was not just over like that. It took time and a considerable amount of energy. And when the stranger cried to be released after injuring Jacob in the hip, he continued to hold on. Jacob didn't just let the stranger go, no, he held on just a little bit longer, maybe longer than he was comfortable with. He was probably ready to be done, exhausted from the struggle and ready to tend to his fresh hip wound. Now, when I played rugby back in college, some of you laugh, but that was a great time in my life. One of the most important things I was taught about the game of rugby was that when you went to tackle someone and you both hit the ground, you didn't just let go. You gave a final squeeze. Not to be a jerk. Some people maybe, not me. But you did it to finish the tackle, a clean tackle. If you let go too early, you ran the risk of getting yourself hurt and even hurting the other person. It was like a signal that the tackle had been completed. And as the tackler, you had to stick it out and see it through to the end. So when the stranger cries to be let go, Jacob knew he had to see this whole ordeal through to the end. He couldn't just let this stranger run off. He needed to complete the match. And that final squeeze, well, that was to get the blessing. A blessing in the Hebrew term, in the Hebrew sense, barach. It was a solemn, deliberate act through which specific and concrete advantages were conveyed, that when a blessing was given to someone, it had the potential to then be passed down to another, your children. A blessing meant inheritance and power. It also wasn't something that could be taken away. Once blessed, it stayed forever. And so, with God's blessing at this place, Jacob was reminded that throughout his struggles to move forward in his life, that God would still be with him. He needed the assurance that God was going to be there for him, as unperfect and broken as any of us might find ourselves to be, before he could take the next step towards his reconciliation with his brother. But he didn't just get away with the blessing. Before that blessing was bestowed, Jacob was changed. As Miguel de la Torre says, he went from Jacob with a swagger to Jacob with a stagger. You won't forget that. His struggle left him with a permanent limp, a lifelong reminder of what he had been through at Peniel. Now, some of you might be thinking, all right, Shelley, you've already given away the premise. God's already with us. God won't abandon us whenever we wrestle with God. That is a truth. And I wholeheartedly believe that. And I want you to hear it again over and over because you can never hear it enough. But that is not the part of this morning's story that we're going to focus on. In light of the fact that God's love and continual presence never leave us, it is the act of wrestling and coming out changed that is most important for us here this morning. This wrestling match must happen before Jacob can seek out his reconciliation. Miguel de la Torre, a theologian, says of Jacob in this story, regardless of who or what this supernatural being is, before Jacob deals with his brother, he must first deal with his God. Jacob can seek reconciliation with his brother all he wants, but first, he's got to get right with God, and he's got to get right with himself. Whether he knew it or not, Jacob had unfinished business with himself. He wasn't just wrestling with God, he was wrestling Jacob. He was wrestling the parts of himself deep down inside that were still hurting and that were fearful of what might lie ahead for him. He was wrestling with the broken parts of himself. While he is the wounded victor in our story, he, like us, was not free of brokenness that can hold us back from moving forward in our lives. Now, each time we wrestle with ourselves, with the things inside of us that weigh us down or that keep us from reconciliation in our lives, whenever we wrestle with God or with our faith, we too come out changed. We're not the same people that we were before. And now Jacob came out of his struggle with a limp and even with a new name. And they served as constant reminders of what he went through, but also as reminders of God's continual presence in the midst of struggle. Each time we struggle with ourselves, we come out different, forever changed. We carry scars on our hearts that map out our lives and remind us of where we've come from and what we've been through. And this is what it means to wrestle with ourselves, because it isn't just about reconciliation or forgiveness or blessings, but it's also about the work that we do to get there. In his book, Dear Church, writer and Lutheran pastor Lenny Duncan confronts his beloved denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and he dares them to address all the problems plaguing not just their churches, but all of our churches. Systematic racism, homophobia, sexism, ageism, all the isms that pleads with them as a lover would to a partner to be better. He challenges them to look inwards and to get right with themselves, to wrestle with the things that cause them brokenness, and by doing so, they can become truly right with God and with one another. Because before any of us can serve the world and live out God's call on our lives, we must first look internally and recognize the things that are broken within us and the things that hold us back. But as Duncan calls the church out for their sins and brokenness, he also acknowledges and repents of his own. He too is guilty of living into toxic systems and ideas that uplift some and suppress others, where he benefits while the backs of others are constantly walked across for the good of the church. His love letter to the church is also a letter of admission of his own wrongdoings and failures. Duncan knows that none of us can keep going along our journeys in the world as a church without first looking inward at who we are and what baggage we carry around that can hold us back. We must first wrestle with those things that are within ourselves, holding us back from truly taking the next steps in our lives. But Duncan reminds the church over and over that even in the midst of doing this messy work of confronting all the things that hold us back as a church, and from fully living into the possibilities that God has laid out for us, that God will still be with us in the mess, just as God has been with all the others who came before us with their messes. Just like God was with Jacob here, just like God was with Abraham and Sarah in their messes, and just like God is with us constantly. It is those struggles, those wrestling matches that we must have with the parts of ourselves that we need to deal with that will define who we are and how we move forward in the world as God's people. These wrestling matches will leave us changed. They might even leave us wounded, and they may even give us a new name. But we are not to hide those changes in ourselves. We are not to pretend that we have never been wounded. In fact, it is those wounds that make it so that we can move forward. Those wounds give us empathy and understanding. They give us pause to think. They force us to deal with them because they don't go away. And when we recognize these wounds in ourselves and in others, in our church and in other churches, then we know the struggles that others have been through. We know we are not alone on the journeys, and we show others who have yet to struggle that they too can come out on the other side, and that their wounds won't be the only things that define them, and they won't be the end of them either. Priest Henry Nouwen once wrote, "Nobody escapes being wounded. We are all wounded people, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The main question is, how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing," he says, "we have become wounded healers." Now, I believe that Father Nouwen was right. No one can escape being wounded. It will happen to us all eventually. But it is how we struggle, knowing that through those wrestling matches with God at our side, we will come out different, yet still whole people, beloved by God. We will still carry God's blessing with us. There is nothing we can do to get rid of it. That is the good news, people. But like Jacob, I imagine we all need to be reminded of God's blessing every now and then. So anytime you need to be reminded, look at your own woundedness and remember that those are the things that enable you to move forward in the world, because you, like Jacob, you have seen the face of God. You have wrestled with your own brokenness, and you have passed by Peniel in your lives. Your lives have not only been saved, they have been affirmed. And each time you must wrestle with your own brokenness, because it is never a one and done kind of thing, folks. Know that you will come out on the other end, because God will be right there with you, and you will walk out with a new limp, but always with God's blessing. Amen. Friends, God is here, reaching out to all who gather. God is here listening to the prayers of all. God is here giving grace where hearts are wounded. God is here. God is here. God has never left us, and God will never leave us. And so knowing that truth, that wonderful joy, the good news that God will never forsake us or leave us, go out. Tackle the things in the world, in your jobs, in your homes, in your lives, in your hearts that hold you back, so that you too can go forward and seek reconciliations in this world, so that we can make this place the place God intended it to be. And all God's people said, Amen.